Sorry about that. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, Rick Gold. Besides chairing the ILR Curriculum Committee, and I'll say being on our board and facilitating many courses, Rick is trained and has worldwide experience as an anti-corruption specialist. He managed USAID anti-corruption programs in Egypt, Bangladesh, and Timor-Leste. Is that right, Rick? Rick designed an anti-corruption program for the education sector in Liberia. He has studied corruption in Jordan, Tunisia, Moldova, Bosnia, and North Macedonia. In addition, he studied the impact of COVID responses on corruption around the world and is now studying transnational corruption in the Middle East and North Africa. And we're pleased to welcome Rick Gold this morning. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can we put up the PowerPoint? So, good morning, everyone. I wanted to start out by talking about the fact that sometimes we see corruption and we don't even know that it's there. When you think about all of the expensive real estate in New York or in Miami, you wonder, where does the money for that come from? We're talking about, million-dollar or multi-million-dollar mansions and things like that, yachts, and even where does the financing for films come from? What we're finding is that the corruption that everybody had thought about on regularly in terms of like paying off a policeman or traffic cop or paying for a permit or whatever the government services provide. That's integrally interrelated with corruption around the world. And it's basically a concept of global corruption that is based on the highest level of corruption in individual countries. And then where do you find, where can those who are the most corrupt put their money? And I'll be talking a lot about that today. So we need to start out with a definition of corruption. And as I said, the definitions of corruption have modified over the years. Currently, one good definition is by USAID in their anti-corruption policy of 2 years ago. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power or influence for personal or political gain, whether corruption is perpetuated by public officials or external actors. Its defining characteristic is the exploitation of power and access to subvert the public good in service of narrow personal, economic, or political interests. And what this really is based on is the exploitation of power, not just formal power, but informal power to divert, misappropriate, or capture resources, goods, and access that should be used in service of the public good. And while systemic corruption remains a pervasive challenge within countries around the world, it's also metastasized into a global malignancy beyond the purview of individual countries or community. Now, why does corruption occur? There are lots of reasons. Some of them that I've identified are individuals' efforts to just live and survive and to earn a living, regardless of the law. Poor governance at various levels, discretion of government officials. Government officials have the discretion to say yes or no, and often they're not supervised or they're not overseen. Impunity for corruption. Well, in some places, nobody cares that corruption occurs, or it's just considered a fact of life. Lack of transparency. The government is not sharing information about its operations. And that makes it difficult for the government to be held accountable. The inability of government to prevent and punish abuse of its resources. Some governments are just so weak that even though they're aware that there are significant amounts of the government budget that are just being sort of slipped away, they don't have the real institutions or laws or capacity to punish those who are involved. A lack of trust in government. Some people say that, well, government is not doing anything for us, and we just take things into our own hands. Culture of corruption, the acceptance that corruption is the way things are. Capture of government by private interests. Government, in some places, in some government institutions, are not responding to the population. They're responding to those either that they regulate or perhaps from the private sector who want to control their actions. Okay. And so what forms does public corruption take? Some of them are administrative or petty corruption and grand or political corruption. Administrative corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, usually by low to mid-level government officials in interactions with citizens and the private sector, including to skirt official regulations and extort citizens in exchange for basic services. Now, grand corruption, or it's sometimes called political corruption, is when political elites steal large sums of public funds or otherwise abuse power for personal or political advantage. There are a couple forms of grand corruption. One of the worst is kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is a government controlled by officials who use political power to appropriate the wealth of their nation. And state capture is when private entities improperly and corruptly influence a country's decision-making process for their own benefit. And just an example of the ways that kleptocracies try to improve their reputation is by giving money to universities abroad. So University of Florida, if it's taking grants from Saudi Arabian government, the government of Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and others, is making a compromise because in many ways the source of those funds involves corruption. And it's an effort by those governments and those associated with the governments to improve their reputation. Much of state capture involves procurement abuses. Government procurement is usually the major source of grand corruption. In addition, there are abuses of political finance. And that means that other governments, private sector individuals, or those involved in the political field can use corruption for strategic purposes by funding political parties in other countries. So that is another example of state capture. A third form of corruption is transnational corruption. And this types of corruption crosses borders, involves global networks, and employs sophisticated schemes to siphon off the wealth of a country from its rightful owners, the people. And here is where I spoke particularly about strategic corruption. And that's when a government weaponizes corrupt practices as a tenet of its foreign policy. So when we see China or Russia hacking civil society in the US or political parties, that often is considered strategic corruption. Another aspect of transnational corruption is money laundering. And money laundering has been around for a long time, of course, but it's become a lot more prevalent over the recent years. And we are much more aware of it, particularly because of the efforts of investigative journalists to identify some really problematic transactions. And I'll get back to that later. There are multiple ways that money laundering takes place, but often it requires the efforts of what we call enablers, accountants, lawyers, and those who are trying to take advantage of legal or illegal ways of moving money that needs to be hidden. And so sometimes they work with banks that are poorly regulated, or they help create what we call shell companies, companies that have no real use other than to help in hiding money. And there are both enablers in both, actually in three ways. In the country of initiation, they're in the countries of transit, and then in countries of receipt, or where the money is actually hidden. So as I noted on this PowerPoint page, a lot of the money goes into real estate, some goes into luxury goods. You'll find some in bank accounts or other investments. Just trying to, overall the effort is to try to make the money look legitimate. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but based on the Panama Papers that were a database of companies that were involved in hiding money, as well as others such as the Pandora Papers, lots of different leaks of data. Analysts have been able to identify where money originates from, where where it transits, and where it goes, and how shell companies are set up. So you'll see actually at the center of this sort of map is the British Virgin Islands. That is the major center of shell companies in order to facilitate money laundering. You'll also, if you look closely, you'll see Switzerland is a place where money transits through. The United Kingdom, United States is involved, including various states, North Dakota and Delaware, and even Florida have participated in helping hide money. And in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates is a major source of transiting money from, particularly from Africa. So this is it's a fascinating analysis, a visual analysis. And politically exposed persons are government officials and those at the highest levels of government who are the most likely to be involved in hiding the money that they gain from corruption. Okay. So another way of looking at public corruption is the sectoral corruption. And so each sector has its own potential for corruption: economic growth, water and sanitation, health, environment, education, democracy, human rights and governance, peace and security, and then even across sectors, there's the potential for corruption. Now, I had been involved in designing an education anti-corruption program in Liberia. And there I found that there were a few aspects of, or ways that corruption showed itself in the education sector. One was that teachers, in many cases, provided grades and tutoring to students by requiring particularly female students to have sex with them. It's very prevalent in Liberia and actually in many other countries. But also what we found through a particular action was that a large percentage of the diplomas or degrees of the teachers were fake. And we brought them all together, the high school teachers, and we helped review each of their documents, and most of them were forged. So, and then the problem is, well, if a third of the teachers have forged documents, what do you do with them? Especially when you need teachers. So in some cases, they just stayed in their jobs. But also, institutions have corruption. Say like you're running a Ministry of Health or a Department of Education or Agriculture or whatever. Each of them has potential for corruption, and particularly in the areas of public procurement. But also, if they are regulating private sector or other organizations, that there's always a significant potential for corruption. And then sometimes there's corruption that cuts across institutions. And I wanted to raise also the fact that when we talk about money laundering or anti-money laundering efforts, often it was associated with stopping money from going to terrorist organizations. But it's been expanded to stopping the laundering of money from corruption. It also includes the laundering of money from drug proceeds. So when we talk about how public corruption takes place, there's an intimate linkage with terrorism, militias, gangs, as we see in Haiti, and criminal violence. I did a study of the community security in Haiti just a couple years ago. And one of the things that was quite interesting was that politicians and business people had strong linkages, financial linkages with gangs. And the politicians eventually were hoping that gangs would support them during election periods. And so they financed the gangs' weapons, a lot of them that came from the US. So, you know, it gets rather murky and requires an enormous investigation, but nevertheless, many countries are plagued by not only corruption, but also the linkage of corruption with violence. Then there's private corruption, not public, but private corruption. And private corruption, you know, has been the focus of governments for a while, but it's been more like, you know, how do you prevent fraud? And some of the ways that private corruption takes place are abuses of laws affecting private contracts with no governments involved, supply chain corruption. At each step along the way, there's corruption in sourcing materials and equipment, et cetera. Bribing of state-owned government officials to win subcontracts. So in many cases, the state-owned institutions or companies are the only ones involved in gaining government contracts, but they subcontract, and that's where the international corruption takes place. Illegal contributions to political parties and candidates from private sector, and I've gone over that. Commercial bribery and kickbacks for supplying for supplying distributors, extortion and solicitation, gifts and hospitality, fees and commissions, collusion, trading of information, trading and influence, embezzlement, favoritism, nepotism, cronyism, clientelism. The list goes on, and governments have to put in place laws to deal with that. Let's take a look at the impact of corruption. And first of all, if corruption is public, then it results in fewer government resources available to do things that are quite necessary and respond to the interest of the population and the objectives of the government. Then there's potential loss of trust in government. If the government is responsible for frittering away the tax contributions of population, and there are all types of scandals, people lose trust in government. The most negative effect of corruption or public corruption is on groups that have the least political power, such as minority groups, LGBTQ, women, religious minorities, etc. Always they're the most affected. And then a sectoral impact, as I went over all those sectors, the fewer money that's available, the less that institutions can do. And then loss of resources overall available for countries' development. So how do governments and organizations describe the impact of corruption? Well, I have a few quotes. For the Biden administration, they said, globally, corruption saps economic growth, hinders development, destabilizes government, undermines democracy, and provides openings for dangerous groups such as criminals, traffickers, and terrorists. USAID, or the U.S. Agency for International Development, says, corruption is development in reverse. It deepens poverty, deters high-quality private investment, depletes health budgets, diverts life-saving humanitarian assistance, accelerates environmental devastation and climate change, and robs children of a decent education. Rampant graft fuels public outrage with predatory institutions, aggravating state fragility, and enabling armed groups to present themselves as a better alternative to corrupt governments. Corruption can also fund organized crime and armed actors who then mobilize violence in order to protect their interests. Women, marginalized communities, and the extreme poor bear the brunt of these harms as corruption exacerbates unequal power relations and reinforces political, social, and cultural exclusion, which in turn makes it harder for these populations to hold corrupt officials accountable. Then the International Monetary Fund says that corruption alters the incentives of individuals entrusted with public authority, undermines the ability of states to deliver inclusive and sustainable growth, and lifts people out of poverty. It is a corrosive force that eviscerates the vitality of business and stunts a country's economic potential. And finally, IFES, or the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, speaks particularly about political corruption's impact. Political corruption thrives and expands in unjust systems of power. So the more unjust or autocratic a country's governing structure, the more corruption can flourish. There are some international frameworks, conventions to address corruption. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption was created in 2003 and has been ratified by most countries of the world, including, surprisingly, the US, which doesn't seem to ratify too many international conventions. It has a main policy-making body. It's called the Conference of the State Parties, which met in December in Atlanta. It lays out much of the requirements of government and the private sector to deal with corruption in terms of developing laws and institutions. Then there are regional conventions. Europe has one, Africa, Latin America, that nations sign on to in terms of making commitments to address corruption. The Financial Action Task Force is a international body that was set up particularly to focus on money laundering and to put in place standards to deal with money laundering. At the national level or local level, what frameworks and initiatives help prevent, mitigate, and punish acts of corruption? Well, in many cases, you have to start from the beginning and integrate into the nation's constitution the institutional framework that's required for dealing with corruption, as well as the legal framework. In many cases, that requires separation of powers, and the US looks at it from perspective of checks and balances. Then helping set up a whole set of institutions that deal with corruption, those focusing on preventing it, investigating it, prosecuting it, and ensuring that the judiciary can deal with it effectively. National strategies against corruption are often set up, and they focus on a range of issues and address the government as a whole. One of the important tactics is ethics and ethics for government officials, asset declarations for them as well. It's interesting, I was visiting Jordan to do an assessment of corruption there, and the judges had a required asset declaration. Asset declarations are useful so that you can compare, what a government employee owns at one point in time with what a government employee owns at another point in time, and to be able to raise questions. Well, is there unexplained wealth there? And so in Jordan, all the judges submitted their asset declarations, but no one was allowed to see them. So it just went into a box. And that actually happens more often than not. So, some of the principles of national strategies are to ensure oversight and transparency. Often there's efforts to put in place strategies at lower levels than the national level. And the long-term effort to address corruption has often been through auditors or inspector generals, and either they are at the national level or they are inspector generals in each agency or institution. There are a strong effort to focus on identifying corruption through investigations. Sometimes it's through the police, sometimes it's through anti-corruption organizations, sometimes it's through prosecutors themselves. But in any case, a lot of prosecution is the focus of much of the anti-corruption efforts. And that doesn't mean that it necessarily works. So few cases actually get to being prosecuted or, having any type of judicial decision. Protecting whistleblowers is an important part of the process, as well as witnesses. And there needs to be ways to ensure that corruption is controlled during emergencies. As Julia noted, I recently did a study of corruption associated with government responses to COVID. And it seemed to be the same almost throughout the world, that the governments said, well, we're going to reduce the requirements for public procurement, and we're going to put money into the hands of the public or the poor and the private sector to get things going. And they just they reduced the controls over money from government funds. And surprisingly, there was lots of corruption, including in the US with our programs. And then anti-corruption can often be used by political leaders for their own political gain. It's basically as a means of attacking their political enemies. So that's a little difficult. A couple other tactics are regulating enablers, adjusting bank secrecy laws to identify money laundering. Okay, so it's not just up to the government to attack corruption. Media is very much involved, and particularly investigative journalists. And their role is to expose government corruption, to expose private and political corruption, to follow the money in their stories, where it comes from. And the example that I brought up a bit earlier is um, the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, and others. And I'm going to see whether we can take a look at the offshore leaks database. And I think I'll go over there and see if that works. So this is the database of many different leaks, including Pandora Papers, Paradise Papers, uh, Bahama leaks, offshore leaks, and others. And what I had done here is I did a search of anything involved with the British Virgin Islands. And so what you see here is the various companies that are usually they're shell companies, but not always. Some are, quite well known, like Grant Thornton, and but nevertheless, um, uh, it just shows what countries they're linked to, and the sources of it. And if you click on, let's see, here's one, United Investments Virgin Islands. You can click on the company and find out a little bit more about it. And these are just incredible resources for journalists to be able to track funding that has been hidden or used in suspicious ways. I noted that yesterday, the the Washington Post, I think, had an article on like $50 million that was given by Qatar to political candidates in the U.S. So it's databases like this that help to do that. Okay, so partnering with media is civil society, non-governmental organizations, advocacy groups, and they have various methods for addressing corruption, including monitoring and tracking corruption, uh, developing their own databases, and measuring corruption. And I'll get into that in a minute. And then undertaking advocacy and litigation in cases of corruption that they find, and working with journalists. All right, so I'm not going to go over everything here, but just to say that when you're talking about like best practices in preventing corruption, there are 20 or 5 of them that have been identified, including such things as like digital government, freedom of information, open data, etc. So those involved in anti-corruption have been able to identify them, as well as a similar number of best practices for investigating and prosecuting corruption cases. And some of them are quite interesting. There's a new procedure that the British government uses to try to analyze why some people or organizations have unexplained wealth. And so it's not just government officials, but it's also those who might benefit from corrupt activity. Okay, so how does the U.S. government help prevent, mitigate, and punish acts of corruption? There are lots of ways. The it's important. The U.S. has always helped regulate banks, ensure that banks don't receive funds from corrupt individuals, or at least have to do certain amount of reporting. Um, Auditing institutions, as I spoke of earlier, um, criminalizing, investigating, and prosecuting domestic corruption. The U.S. Primarily is focusing on corruption that occurs within its borders, but also is interested in corruption around the world and the way that it has slops over into the U.S. Creating a beneficial ownership registry. A beneficial ownership registry basically says that it's a list of who is the actual owner of a particular company or organization. And under a recent law, starting in January 2024, companies have been required to provide beneficial ownership information to the Department of Treasury, and the institution involved is the Financial Crime Enforcement Network. And that's the network that is responsible for investigating money laundering in the US, and particularly requiring that banks report on suspicious transactions. Another thing that the US does is regulating money laundering enablers. There was an effort to push through a bill that particularly cracked down on those who are enabling money laundering, and it was it never was passed, partly because the American Bar Association fought it. So you can see who has that interest. I'm tracking the time, so I'm not going to talk too much longer. The U.S. has criminalized foreign bribes by U.S.-based companies. For several years, we've had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that has made it a crime for any companies based in the U.S. To bribe foreign officials. What we're trying to do, or the U.S. is trying to do now, is to move towards criminalizing the request of bribes by foreign officials to U.S. companies. And the fact that the U.S. had this law in place actually made it difficult for the U.S. to compete with other countries' businesses that weren't required to report efforts for bribes. Then there's the whole U.S. sanction regime, which is not only on countries like Iran, or Russia, but also on corrupt individuals, and it is a power for the U.S. government to freeze the assets under the Global Magnitsky Act. My main areas is particularly designing, soliciting foreign anti-corruption projects and activities. And that includes developing the newest technologies to fight corruption. Often they're involved with digitized government or digitalized government. And then one thing that foreign governments, whether they're kleptocracies or whatever, that they like the most is help in recovering the assets that have been stolen from them or ferreted out through money laundering. Donors work on all different aspects of prevention, mitigation, and punishment of acts of corruption. And given the time, I'm not going to share There are several different ways that corruption is measured. Transparency International, an NGO, has put together a corruption perception index, and that's because it's very difficult to find ways of measuring an activity that, by its nature is hidden, which is corruption. So they talk to experts and they say, in what areas is there corruption in this country? And then they put together scores and then they rate countries. And so their index is considered quite important by many governments, how they're doing, whether they're making progress. And the World Bank has the control of corruption indicators. And then there's other indicators or indexes. One is dealing with financial secrecy, and turns out that country that has the greatest level of financial secrecy is the US. So, and so donors also help with implementation of the US Convention Against Corruption, the FATF on money laundering, and other conventions. They help governments put in place anti-corruption laws, institutions and systems. They strengthen overall the rule of law and judicial independence. And they help governments put in place strategies and help them to implement them. In addition, donors are very supportive of groups like the media and civil society and private sector to fight corruption. Other ways that donors are involved are helping to improve governance and political governance, political economy, and to do analyses and strategies. There have been for several years to international activities focusing on extractive industries and open governance that many governments have been participating in, helping the private sector and civil society deal with integrity issues, and helping governments facilitate transit or investment of laundered funds, helping them fight money laundering, basically. And I've gone over some of this. One area that I haven't talked about is financial intelligence units. And like the Department of Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they are set up to fight money laundering. And so around the world, these institutions need help, including the one in the US. It doesn't really get much support. So how has the Biden administration fought global corruption? First of all, compared to previous administrations, it designated anti-corruption as a core national security interest, and it did this particularly in the US strategy on countering corruption. And this was a all-of-government effort, and so strategy has been implemented through multiple agencies. At USAID, they issued an anti-corruption policy, as well as a decluptification guide. And USAID, like the White House, has been focusing on the importance of transnational corruption, which previously was very hard to deal with. And so, okay, so this is hard to see, but these are the 5 pillars of the US strategy on countering corruption. And see if I can read it here. modernizing, coordinating, and resourcing U.S. government efforts, curbing illicit finance, holding corrupt actors accountable, preserving and strengthening the multilateral anti-corruption architecture, and improving diplomatic engagement and leveraging foreign assistance resources. So each one of those have, there are multiple actions to achieve them. So what have we learned about fighting corruption? A lot. I think that bottom line is that any particular tactic doesn't work, that there needs to be, multiple efforts among multiple government agencies and multiple governments to address corruption. And given that it's a worldwide phenomenon, it requires a focus on the world as a whole, in addition to focusing on, just the average encounter between citizens and government officials. It requires a deep understanding of the context, the political economy, and other types of understandings that enable activities to be designed effectively. There's the efforts required not only by government itself, but also citizens' movements, that corruption needs to be fought by people overall and through various political movements. One of the lessons learned is that you can't just look at it from a top-down perspective. It has to be looked at top-down and bottom-up, and there has to be accompanied by sanctions for wrongdoing, but as well as promotion of positive incentives for avoiding corruption. And then there needs to be a focus on the culture of corruption, social norms, and ways to change the cultures of institutions. We've seen in many cases that efforts to improve police bodies, for example, have been stymied because even if technically a strategy might work, the culture of the police might prevent it. Connections with transnational organized crime and beneficial ownership are really need to be highly emphasized. And then often it is difficult to fight corruption until there's a magic moment arrives when we call a reform window opens, when people are really, and organizations are really open to fighting corruption effectively. So that's it for my presentation, and I'm glad to accept comments and questions. As well as online. So.
Hi. That's a rather difficult thing to do when certain countries they're run by corruption, and the people can't do anything about it, and the politicians certainly aren't. So how do you go about changing that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the reform windows opening, and that there's a sense that, well, corruption's there, it's always been there, there's nothing you can do about it, but there is, and there have been efforts that have been successful to clean out. When I was in the Philippines, the customs agency came to USAID and said, we've lived with corruption for so long, but now it's getting totally out of control. can you help us? And USAID helped them to, change their institution, and it requires a lot of effort. But I can understand when citizens, the civil society groups, the private sector just throw up their hands and say, what can we do by ourselves?
Hi, thank you for your talk. This is kind of a specific question, but it's more just so I can understand the resources that you shared with us. So I took a quick peek at that Corruption Perception Index site, and I noticed that Bermuda's not listed as one of the 180 companies, but on that the map that you showed, there's some very distinct lines between Canada and the United States. So I was just curious why Bermuda wasn't on that list.
Yeah, well, that's actually not too specific, even though it seems like it. The question in general is, why are those countries that are heavily involved in money laundering or reception of money laundering funds not reflected as very corrupt? And so that includes the U.S. We know the U.S. absorbs lots and lots of dirty money from around the world. But when you look at the Corruption Perception Index, we're pretty we're pretty high in terms of being a clean country or government. And so the issue really is that they're measuring the perception of corruption from the perspective of the local people, and transnational corruption is often at such a high level that it doesn't get into the perception measurements. So we know that, like, Bermuda in many ways is a clean government, but it also is a haven for money laundering. So.
Rick, a chat question. Are there effective models for purging corruption from academic institutions?
I haven't dealt with that, but I think that each institution needs to take a look. Of course, there are auditors and accounting requirements, and there's, particularly with large institutions like University of Florida, there needs to be opportunities for those who are concerned with these issues to see the data that's involved, and that's transparency and accountability, and to be able to meet with government, with university officials. It just reminds me that I was in Tunisia, and I organized a meeting of journalists to talk about what they are doing to either to fight corruption, and they said, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about corruption in the media. And yeah, it's true that the media often is a very corrupt environment and has been in many countries. Phyllis?
Thank you very much, Rick. That was very stimulating for me. And as you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking of all the aspects that I've learned of corruption in the U.S. government and the U.S. society since the beginning of our nation. During wartime, not during wartime, I mean after the Civil War, what was going on as the industries built up, and then the reformers, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Then I started thinking about socio-political corruption, i.e., look at Russia over the centuries has a cultural tradition of terrorizing its population. And that's one of the ways they maintain power. So there's many different forms of corruption, not just financial corruption or gangs or that sort of thing, but there's often a governance tradition of terrorism that maintains control. And I'm thinking like the Nazis, for example. Not that this practice was perpetrated by the German governments over the centuries, but in Russia, certainly, and to some extent, China. Can you think of any other aspects like that?
Well, in many countries, the repression of the human rights activists and others is purposely to facilitate the ongoing practices of corruption and to prevent criticism of them. And so, often military coups are justified on the basis of fighting corruption. So there are people on or entities on both sides that are using the issue for political violence.
Any other questions? Rick, thank you for giving us a lot to think
My
about
pleasure.
today. We appreciate your presentation.